the political in poetry has, of course, been in the discourse for some time now, and it sort of resonates in some of your own poems. Say, for example, these lines from Mr. S on first looking into Parthasarathi Silapatikaram. I really like some of these lines where you describe Mr. S as having without any semblance of practical politics and yet somehow political. So I see that you are trying to deal, and there's another poem on necessity of speaking of caste in this collection. So there's a certain way you're trying to deal with the political in your poetry, but how do you think can the political be spoken of through poetry without necessarily compromising on the poem itself or on poetry per se?
I think that a large part of the poem's potential political power, or power to effect change in society, put it that way, has to do with the fact that it can't be tamed. That poetry is by definition free speech. That's almost like the definition of a poem is free speech, and so the power of a poem is in resisting a single reading, in having many things going on inside of it, in being honest. When I approach the question of politics on my poetry, I feel that it would be dishonest of me to leave out my own privilege, my own positions of privilege. For instance, as a coming from upper middle class, upper caste male, so the point is not just to repeat a slogan, but also interrogate myself as a speaker in a poem. So it is so these all the kind of when these come together, I think these all what make a poem real and powerful. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be just, there's an sometimes, what we do need to set slogans to music, political slogans to music, and there's a value in that. But I think if we're really going to make our poems powerful, we have to think about the question of honesty, of interrogation, of contradiction, of love, of desire, and so I think that sometimes that even in the context of the political poem, the question of quality or of efficacy doesn't go away, and we have to keep asking that question, not least because there's a kind of a connection between poetry, a troubling connection between poetry and political oratory. So we have seen in our country, Modi has published a collection of poems, and Varun Gandhi has published a collection of poems, and so on. And there's Kapil Sibal has. So we have a tradition of politicians who are used to a kind of seductive rhetoric. That's the art of being a politician, is mastering a seductive rhetoric. So we have to really keep asking the harder, deeper questions about a poem, and we have to resist just taking on a poem only because it seems to be saying all the right things in it.
Now, if carrying that forward now in, say, poetry circles around, I'll ask that later. So if I link this to, say, the context in India, when the other side, which defends freedom of speech, say, will talk about Agha Shahid Ali in a particular fashion, they'll also always fashion him around as a rebel poet or a Kashmiri poet. And if one actually reads, say, The Country Without a Post Office or his own interviews, he is constantly saying that there is no one way of reading Kashmir. But somehow the progressive side too sort of reduces the poem to one kind of reading. Do you think there's a danger there as well, and there has to be a like much more deeper engagement with the poem itself, with close readings and other kinds of stuff? Do you think it's happening in the discourse around poetry in India when it comes up? For example, when it came up in this case in JNU and Aga Shahid Ali and The Country Without a Post Office.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is happening on some level, that because the appeal of Shahid's poems is certainly their politics, but even before the politics is their approach to desire, and the way they follow the lines of desire, and so the reason why we're talking about Shahid anyways, at least I think, is because his poems are doing something to us that goes beyond the political statement, although they make that. Same with Faiz and so many others. But I do think that there's a danger when we have a situation where debate goes to such a crude kind of simplified level, and where the kind of regressive culture is kind of pushing it into that. There's a danger that we're going to be pushed into a place of kind of simplifications as well, and I think that we should resist that, and that we should try to bring as much creativity and inventiveness to our art, and openness to our art and our thinking about art, and that is as possible. That we should try to be as creative and inventive as possible, and so there's room to push that further, and I think that is what will make a more robust cultural practice.
Apart from, say, the writing of poems or writing of poetry, we do know that writers or poets, or say by writers I eventually mean novelists, but they do also engage with, say, the public sphere. Say Parimal, whether they want to or not, say Parimal Murugan, or when the writers were returning their awards, the Sahitya Academy Awards, or resigning from the posts. Do you think that as far as Indian English poets are concerned, they sort of fall back a little bit, or in terms of like direct political interventions into things?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that in their different ways, for instance, writers like K.K. Daruwala and Adil Jasawala have made their opinions felt, and it's another thing whether anybody really cares what the Indian English poet has to say, but I do think that in general what happens is that we don't ask the harder questions about our poetry sometimes, and in as much as the Indian English poetry scene is still largely a kind of elite scene, then it's going to be subject to the same kind of complacency, or even the same kind of fear. So there could be, I don't know if it's true, but I think there could be some kind of maybe general effect that way. But I think that you have to understand that also poetry in English or in any other language is only a very small part of free speech, and it's not a replacement for something else. It's not so I don't see any reason to give any special status to what a poet has to say as to what somebody else has to say. And just because we've written about a poem about something, that doesn't absolve us from having to speak out in the public sphere. And so So in that sense, a writer coming out and saying something is, for me, not that much more special than anybody else coming out and saying something. We all really need to be able to speak out and to get beyond implied threats of violence and implied fears and speak out, regardless of whether we're a writer or not, or what language we work in.
Final question to you is, of late we've also seen this need to include other kinds of voices, especially in the American poetry scene, maybe, when someone used the pseudonym of a Chinese poet and published a poem in the Chinese form, I think.
It was a very ordinary poem written by with somebody putting on a Chinese name. Yeah.
So there was a debate there, and now in India, say, there is the category of other kinds, say poetry related to, say, some kind of identity, say women's writing or Dalit writing, or in the West maybe poets of color. So how do you, as we understand that it is important to have these categories, but how do you sieve or negotiate again with poetry and identity, and how do you think that can be done?
Well, I think that we have to ask the question about, do we want a very narrow literature, or do we want a literature that is wide and willing to absorb? And I think that when we look back on this time, and we find that the literature is just written by a handful of people from very specific backgrounds, we'll find a kind of thinness about it. So I think that the stakes are like that for me, that if we include women's voices, Dalit voices, that we include we cast our net in terms of the diversity of people contributing to it, that's in fact going to expand the literature and make it more powerful for all of us, because we have we have something to learn from the voices that aren't heard, and so I think that the argument for diversity is really an argument for expanding the scope and power and depth of our literature.
Thanks, Vivek, for talking to us.